inner aspect of the Saturn embodiment of the Earth. If we wish to continue to explore the reflections we worked on last year in our branch evenings, we shall have to master some concepts, ideas, and perceptions other than those we have spoken of so far. Footnote, see Rudolf Steiner, Background to the Gospel of St. Mark. End of footnote. For what we have to say about the Gospels and the other spiritual documents of humankind would not by itself be enough, unless we presume the development of our entire cosmic system. We have described this evolution as the embodiment of our planet itself through Saturn, Sun, and Moon existences up to the present Earth existence. Whoever remembers how often we have referred to these fundamental principles also knows how necessary they are for all esoteric observations concerning human evolution. However, if you look at the account of the developmental stages of Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth described in my book Occult Science and Outline, you will have to admit that what is given there is only a sketch. Even if it had been expanded, it would not be otherwise. It is only a sketch from a certain point of view, so that an explanation could then be given from a particular perspective. For just as Earth existence offers an immense wealth of details, so too it stands to reason there are likewise an endless number of details to record about the Saturn, Sun, and Moon existences. Even so, it is always only possible to give a rough sketch or outline of these details. In these lectures, then, we shall have to portray a characteristic of evolution from yet another side. When we ask ourselves where all of these accounts originate, we know that they come from so-called entries in the Akashic Chronicle. We know that whatever once occurred in the course of cosmic development may to some extent be read by means of an impression in a delicate spiritual substance called the Akasha substance. Everything that has happened has left an imprint of this kind from which one can elicit how things once were. In the physical world, when we look at something, we can assume that things nearer to us are generally clear and distinct in their details, and that the farther away things are, the less clear and distinct they appear. Things that are closer to us in time also reveal themselves more exactly than things that are farther removed in time. It is the same when we look back in a supersensible sense. The Saturn or Sun existences, for example, will have less distinct outlines than the Earth or Moon periods of development. But why do this at all? Why do we consider it important to track down a time that lies so far distant from our own? Someone might well ask, why do these anthroposophists bring up these ancient matters today? We certainly do not need to concern ourselves with such things. We have enough to do with what is going on in the present. It would be wrong to speak in such a way. For what was once set into the stream of time continues to come to fruition even today. What was brought into being in the time of Saturn development did not exist simply and exclusively in and for that era. What occurred then continues to affect our time, but it has become veiled and invisible in relation to what exists externally in the physical plane around human beings. Indeed, what occurred so long ago during ancient Saturn existence is barely visible today. Nevertheless, ancient Saturn existence is still significant for humankind. In order to imagine why it is significant for us, let us place the following before our soul. We know that the innermost core of our being stands before us as what we call the I capital. This I, the innermost core of our being, is truly an immaterial, imperceptible entity for humanity today. Just how imperceptible it is can be inferred from what is said about the soul in the so-called quote-unquote official psychologies. These no longer have any notion of what constitutes the being of the I, or indeed that such an I may even be intimated. I have often drawn attention to the fact that in 19th century German psychology, the expression, quote, soul theory without soul, unquote, gradually came into use. The world-famous school of Wilhelm Wundt, which is influential not just in German-speaking countries but is greatly respected wherever psychology is discussed, made this, quote, soul theory without soul, unquote, fashionable. Couple of footnotes. One, Wilhelm Wundt from 1832 to 1920, German physiologist, psychologist, and philosopher, founded the first institute for experimental psychology in Leipzig, 1879. Another footnote, the phrase, quote, soul theory without soul, unquote, was coined by F.A. Lange, 1828 to 1875, in his History of Materialism, 1866, end of footnotes. This soul theory without soul describes soul qualities without presupposing an independent soul entity. Instead, all qualities of the soul first come together in a kind of focal point, that is, gather themselves in the I. That is the greatest absurdity that has ever been linked to a theory about the soul. Yet psychology today stands completely under its influence. Today this notion is celebrated throughout the world. Cultural historians studying our era in the future will have their work cut out for them if they wish to explain plausibly how such a theory could ever have been regarded as the greatest achievement in the field of psychology in the 19th century and well into the 20th. I say this only to point out how unclear official psychology is with regard to the I, the middle point of the human being. If we could grasp the I in its true nature and set it before us in the way we can set the physical body before us, and then tried to discover the environment upon which the I depends, in the sense that the physical body depends upon what is seen outwardly by the eyes and perceived through the senses, and needs nourishment, and discovers clouds, mountains, and so forth in its surroundings in the physical realm. That is, if we tried to discover the essential context for the I in the same sense as we know the context for the physical body, then we would come to a cosmic portrait, or tableau, that invisibly permeates our surroundings even today, and is identical to the cosmic tableau of ancient Saturn. In other words, whoever wishes to come to know the I in its world must be able to imagine a world like that of ancient Saturn. This world is hidden. It is a world that is, for human beings, beyond sense perception. Indeed, at our present level of development, we cannot bear the perception of it. The guardian of the threshold veils it from us. Footnote, the expression the guardian of the threshold comes from Bulwer-Lytton's Zanoni. For Rudolf Steiner's description, see title How to Know Higher Worlds. End footnote. It thus remains concealed, for a certain level of spiritual development is required to withstand the sight of such a tableau. In fact, the sight of such a tableau as ancient Saturn presents... read that again. In fact, the sight of such a tableau as ancient Saturn presents is one to which a person must first become accustomed. Before anything else, you must form an imagination of how one could ever experience such a cosmic tableau as something real. All that you perceive with the senses must be removed from your thinking. Also, insofar as it consists of the usual ebb and flow within the soul, you must abandon your inner world. You must erase thinking about what is in the world, and even dissolve all ideas themselves. You must remove from the outer world everything perceived through the senses. You must extinguish the activity of the soul and of ideas within your inner world. Having done this, if you wish to form an idea of the soul condition that must be reached, if a human being is really to grasp this thought, remember absolutely everything is removed, only the human being remains. Then one can only say that you must be able to bear the terror, the fear of the fathomless void, the endless emptiness that yawns around us. one must be capable of experiencing an environment completely saturated with fear and terror, and yet at one and the same time be able to overcome these feelings through the inner firmness and certainty of one's own being. Without these two dispositions in the soul, the terror of an infinite void of existence and the overcoming of this fear, you cannot possibly experience any inkling of how ancient Saturn existence underlies our cosmic existence. People on their own seldom cultivate the two experiences that I have just characterized. One also finds very little that has been written about this condition. Of course, those who, over the course of time, have tried to explore it with clairvoyant forces know of it. Yet there are very few indications in written or published sources that people have experienced either this terror before an infinite abyss or the overcoming of this fear. In order to gain some insight into this matter, I investigated recent literature in which something like this terror in the face of an immeasurable void appeared. Philosophers are usually very clever, speaking knowledgeably about concepts, but completely avoid mentioning awe-inspiring impressions. So, one does not easily find something recorded in philosophical literature about this matter. I will not speak now of sources where I found nothing, but once I did find an echo of these experiences in the journal of the Hegelian philosopher Karl Rosenkranz. Footnote: Karl Rosenkranz, 1805 to 1879, German Hegelian philosopher. See his title Aus einem Tagebuch, Leipzig, 1854, page 24 and on. End of footnote. In this journal, Rosenkranz described very intimate feelings that he had experienced while immersing himself in Hegelian philosophy. I came across a remarkable passage that he recorded quite innocently in his journal. It was clear to Rosenkranz that Hegelian philosophy is based on Hegel's understanding of quote-unquote pure being. In the philosophical literature of the 19th century, there has been a great deal of superficial talk about Hegel's principle of pure being, but in fact it is very poorly understood. One can almost say that philosophy in the second half of the 19th century understands about as much about Hegel's pure being as an ox understands about Sunday when he had been munching fodder the whole week through. Hegel's concept of pure being, not the process of being, but the state of being as such, is not quite what I characterized as the dreaded emptiness into which fear flows, but all of space in Hegel's being is tinged with a quality that cannot be experienced by humankind, the infinite filled with being. And Karl Rosenkranz once experienced this as the dreadful, shattering state of the coldness of the cosmic expanse of space, devoid of content other than sheer being. To grasp what lies at the basis of the cosmos, it is not enough to speak about it merely in concepts or to make up ideas about it. It is much more important to call up an imagination of what one experiences facing the infinite void that characterizes ancient Saturn existence. Then the soul grasps the feeling of horror, even if only an inkling of it. One can prepare oneself to behold this Saturn condition clairvoyantly by replicating the feeling of vertigo in mountain heights, of standing at the edge of an abyss without a secure footing, of being driven from one place to the next, overwhelmed by forces over which one no longer has any influence. That is the first step, the initial feeling. Then one loses not just the ground under one's feet, but what the eyes see, the ears hear, the hands can grasp, absolutely everything that exists in the surrounding space. And inevitably one loses every thought, plunging into a kind of twilight or sleep state, in which one cannot grasp anything cognitively. Or else one immerses oneself into every feeling, and then nothing else is possible but to slip into a condition of dread, often gripped by a state of dizziness that cannot be overcome. There are two possibilities for human beings today to overcome the grip of fear at the abyss. One established way is through an understanding of the Gospels, through an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. A person who truly understands the Gospels, not in the way modern theologians speak about them, but who absorbs the very deepest of what can be experienced inwardly of the Gospels, takes something with him or her into the abyss that expands as if from a single point, and completely fills the void with a feeling of courage, of being protected through a union with the being who consummated the sacrifice at Golgotha. That is the one way. The other way is to penetrate the spiritual worlds without the Gospels, but with true, authentic anthroposophy. That too is possible. As you know, I always emphasize that when we consider the mystery of Golgotha, we do not begin with the Gospels, for we would discover the mystery of Golgotha even if there were no Gospels. This is something that was not possible before the mystery of Golgotha occurred, but it is so today. Because through the mystery of Golgotha, something came into the world that allows human beings to grasp the spiritual world directly, out of impressions from the spiritual world. We may call this the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world, the rule of cosmic thoughts in the world. But one must be prepared. If, when we must face the terrifying void, we take either the Gospels or anthroposophy with us, then we cannot get lost nor plunge into the infinite abyss. If we approach this ghastly void with the preparation set forth in How to Know Higher Worlds, title, In How to Know Higher Worlds, and the other works following it, footnote How to Know Higher Worlds was in 1904, Theosophy, 1904, Stages of Higher Knowledge, 1905 to 1908, An Outline of Occult Science, 1910, A Road to Self-Knowledge, 1912, and The Threshold of the Spiritual World, 1913. End footnote. Let me read that again. If we approach this ghastly void with the preparation set forth in title How to Know Higher Worlds, and the other works following it, and penetrate the spiritual world, where everything that arises convulses our feelings and seizes our thoughts, we will meet beings who are not at all like those in the realms of animal, plant, or mineral. As we become familiar with and adjusted to Saturn existence, a world in which there are no clouds, no light, no sound, we will come to know beings. Indeed, we will come to know the beings who in our terminology are called the spirits of will, or the thrones. These spirits of will, whom we come to know as an objective reality, comprise, so to speak, a surging sea of courage. What human beings at first can only imagine becomes objective presence through clairvoyance. Think of yourself immersed in the sea, and yet immersed in it as a spiritual being who feels united with the Christ being, upheld by the Christ being, swimming, but now not in a sea of water, but in a sea that completely fills an infinite expanse and consists of flowing courage, surging energy. This is not simply an indifferent, undifferentiated sea. All possibilities and varieties of what we may describe as the feeling of courage come to meet us there. There we become acquainted with beings who consist of courage, yet are also quite individualized. Although they are made up entirely of courage, we encounter them as concrete beings. Naturally, it seems very strange to say that one meets beings who are as real as human beings composed of flesh, but who consist of courage, not flesh. But this is so. We encounter the spirits of will, who are beings of just this sort, and, meeting them, we thereby describe Saturn existence, for that is precisely what the spirits of will, composed of courage, represent. This is Saturn. It is a world that is not shaped like a sphere. It does not have 6 corners or 4 corners. Aspects of space do not apply. Thus there is no possibility of finding an end to Saturn existence. If we wanted to use the image of swimming again, we could say that Saturn is a sea that has no surface. Instead, everywhere, in every direction, spirits of courage or spirits of will are to be found. I will characterize in later lectures how it is that one does not come to this insight immediately. For now I am going to use the sequence I used before: Saturn, Sun, Moon. It is actually better to go in the opposite direction, in the way that it is actually perceived clairvoyantly, namely from Earth to Saturn. But for now I shall characterize it as Saturn, Sun, Moon. The sequence in itself makes no difference. The unique thing about it is that when one lifts oneself to this vision, something arises that is extremely difficult to imagine if one has not taken care to arrive at the ideas slowly and deliberately. For something ceases to exist that is more intimately tied to the ordinary capacity of imagination than anything else. Space ceases to exist. There is no longer any meaning to expressions such as one swims on top of or underneath, in front of or behind, to the right or to the left, or indeed any other similar reference to spatial relationships. In ancient Saturn, spatial relationships make no sense at all. Everywhere is the same. But the most important thing is that when one enters the first periods of Saturn existence, time also ceases. There is simply no earlier or later. That is naturally very difficult for human beings today to imagine, because today a person's ideas themselves flow within time. One thought appears before or after another one. The absence of time, however, may be approximated through a feeling, but this feeling is not a pleasant one. Imagine that your capacity for forming ideas is paralyzed, so that everything that enables you to remember, everything you plan to do, becomes paralyzed like a rigid rod. Thus you feel as if your ideas are held fast and you can no longer touch them. In this condition you cannot say that something you experienced before happened at an earlier point in time. You are connected to it. It is there, but it is absolutely fixed. Time has ceased to have any meaning. It absolutely does not exist. Therefore it is meaningless to ask, now that you have described the Saturn and Sun existences and so forth, can you tell me what was there before the Saturn existence? Before has no meaning in that context. Time did not exist then, and we must do without any designations relating to time. Saturn existence is similar to a situation in which the world has been boarded up. Thoughts have come to a standstill. This is the case for clairvoyance too. Normal thoughts have been left behind. They do not reach that far. Expressed pictorially, your brain is frozen. To the extent that you can perceive this state of paralysis, you can approximate the image of a consciousness that no longer encompasses time. Having come this far, one notices a remarkable change occurring in the whole picture. Beings of other hierarchies penetrate and become active within the paralysis that is the timelessness of the infinite ocean of courage with its spirits of will. At the very moment when the absence of time is evident, one notices the activity of other beings. One notices the presence of something within the infinite ocean of courage, but with unspecified awareness. It is as if one did not experience it. Something lights up this expanse, but it is more like a glow than a quick flash of lightning. It is the first differentiation, a glow, but not a glow that gives the impression of a glowing light. You must try to comprehend these things in different ways. For example, you might imagine something like the following. You meet someone who speaks to you, and you have the feeling, how intelligent this person is. And as the person continues to speak, this feeling intensifies, and you recognize this person is wise, has experienced the infinite, and thus is able to recount wise things. Furthermore, this person makes you feel as if he or she exuded an aura of enchantment. Imagine then this element of enchantment infinitely intensified. Imagine that in the ocean of courage, clouds appear in which there are not exactly flashes of lightning, but shimmering radiance. When you take all of this together, you have an imagination of the beings that now, when you take all of this together, you have an imagination of the beings now active within the spirits of will. Beings who are not merely wisdom, but radiant streams of wisdom. You have here an idea of what, by means of clairvoyant perception, the cherubim are. The cherubim are the beings who stream into the ocean of courage. Now imagine that nothing else surrounds you except what I have described. Actually, as I emphasized earlier, you cannot say that you have something around you. You can only say it is there. You have to think your way into it. Now, the image of something lighting up is not quite accurate. For this reason I said that it is not like a flash, but more like a glowing, for everything occurs at the same time. It is not something that comes into being at one moment and disappears at another. Everything is simultaneous. Nevertheless, one has a feeling of a connection between the spirits of will and the cherubim. One has the feeling that they established a relationship one to another. This becomes a conscious awareness. And one also becomes conscious that the spirits of will, the thrones, sacrifice their own beings to the cherubim. That is the final image one receives moving backward toward Saturn. One receives the image of the spirits of will directing this sacrifice to the cherubim. Beyond this point, it is as if the cosmos were boarded up. But to the extent that we experience this sacrifice of the spirits of will to the cherubim, something is pressed out of, separated from our being. We can express this with the words, "From the sacrifice brought by the spirits of will to the cherubim, time is born." But this time is not abstract time as we usually speak of it. It is an independent being. Only at this point can we speak of something beginning. Time initially is a time being, a being made up entirely of time. Beings are born who consist only of time. These are the spirits of personality, whom we know as Archai in the hierarchy of spiritual beings. In Saturn existence, the Archai are entirely time. We have also described them as time spirits, as spirits who order time. They are born as spirits, but they are actually beings who consist entirely of time. It is extraordinarily important to participate in the sacrifice of the spirits of will to the cherubim, and in the birth of the spirits of time. Only after time is born does something else emerge that allows us to speak about the Saturn condition as if it were something similar to what now surrounds us. What we call the element of warmth in Saturn is the sacrificial smoke of the thrones, which generates time. I have always said that Saturn exists as a state of warmth. In doing so, I have described what exists there. For among all of the elements we have around us at present, we can identify only warmth as an element that also existed in ancient Saturn. Warmth was generated out of the sacrifice that the spirits of will presented to the cherubim. This also shows us how we should think about fire. Where we see fire, where we feel warmth, we should not think about it materialistically, as human beings today naturally and customarily do. Rather, wherever we see warmth, wherever we feel warmth, that is still today the sacrifice of the spirits of will to the cherubim. Even though the spiritual foundation of warmth is invisible in our surroundings, it nonetheless exists. Through this insight, the world arrives at the truth that behind each manifestation of warmth stands a sacrifice. In Occult Science and Outline, my book, mostly only the outer condition of ancient Saturn was described, to avoid offending people too much. Even that caused offense. Those who can think only in current scientific terms regard the book as pure nonsense. But think what it means if a person could actually say, ancient Saturn had at its innermost being, at its very foundation, beings belonging to the spirits of will who sacrificed themselves to the cherubim. Out of the smoke generated by the sacrifice of the spirits of will to the cherubim, time was born. Out of the birth of time, the Hierarchies, or the time spirits, were sent forth. Warmth, as we know it, is the outer semblance, the reflection of the sacrifice of the spirits of will. Now, outer warmth is an illusion, Maya. If we wish to speak the truth, it is. Wherever warmth is manifest, we have in truth sacrifice, the sacrifice of the thrones before the cherubim. Cultivating the capacity of imagination is the second stage of Rosicrucian initiation. This is mentioned often in title How to Know Higher Worlds and elsewhere. Anthroposophists must form imaginations out of sound representations of the world. In this way we can transform thinking into fantasy-imbued imagination. We can take, for example, what we have spoken of today. The thrones, or spirits of will, kneel before the cherubim with complete devotion that arises not out of a feeling of insignificance, but out of the consciousness that they have something that they can sacrifice. The thrones, in this willingness to sacrifice, which is based upon strength and courage, kneel before the cherubim and offer up their sacrifice to them. The thrones send the sacrifice forth as effervescent warmth, flaming warmth, so that the smoke from the fire of sacrifice blazes upward to the winged cherubim. So may we picture this reality. And now, arising from this sacrifice, as if we were speaking a word into the air, and this word were time, but time as beings, from the totality of these occurrences, the spirits of time, or the Hierarchies, emerge. This sending forth of the Hierarchies is a powerful image, and this image placed before our soul is extremely potent for certain imaginations that can bring us ever deeper into the realms of hidden knowledge. This transformation of the ideas we receive into imaginations, pictures, is what we must accomplish. Even if the pictures we make are primitive, even if they are anthropomorphic, even if these beings we try to portray look like winged persons, that is beside the point. It doesn't matter. Whatever needs to be added to our efforts will eventually be given to us. What our imaginations should not have will disappear. If we simply allow ourselves to be immersed in such pictures, that activity itself will actually guide us to such beings. If you can accept this attempt to characterize courage-filled beings overflowing with wisdom, you will see that the soul must soon turn to all manner of pictures that are remote from concepts formed by reason. Intellectual concepts came into existence much later. We ought not to approach the Saturn existence in any case in a purely intellectual way. You must come to understand what it means for clairvoyance to unfold in a person's mind. Someone who describes something out of naive clairvoyance portrays it differently than a person who is intellectually oriented. An intellectual, for his or her part, never properly understands such minds. I want to give you an example of this. Take Albert Schweigler's 1819 to 1857 title History of Philosophy, Stuttgart 1848, a book that students used to like to study before taking their examinations, but which, since the soul has been removed from philosophy, is no longer useful. Even though the book has suffered from revisions in later editions, what was important in the original has not been entirely lost. This book is a history of philosophy from the Hegelian perspective. Thus you can take Schwegler's title History of Philosophy, and you will have a good picture of philosophy in general at the time it was written, and an excellent source on Hegelian philosophy. But now read the short chapter on Jakob Böhme, and you can discover how helpless a person writing an intellectual philosophy is confronted with a spirit like Jakob Böhme. Footnote: Jakob Böhme, 1575 to 1624, settled in Görlitz as a shoemaker in 1594. In 1600 he was granted a profound mystical experience while polishing a pewter mug. For the remainder of his life he sought to put what he had learned into language. A great mystic, philosopher, sophiologist, and theosophist, Böhme drew deeply on Paracelsian alchemy, Kabbalah, as well as Christian esoteric tradition to create a body of work which was to influence diverse strands of the Western tradition, including the theology of the Pietists and Quakers, Romanticism, German idealism, particularly Schelling, Russian philosophy, and contemporary thinkers such as Paul Tillich and Nikolai Berdyaev, Theophrastus Bombastus Paracelsus von Hohenheim, 1493 to 1541. End of footnote. Fortunately, he left out Paracelsus, otherwise he would have written quite terrible things about him. But read what Schwegler wrote about Böhme. He found in Böhme a mind in which not the picture of ancient Saturn, but a repetition of the Saturn picture had dawned in a naive way. This repetition of the Saturn picture is something that is repeated in the Earth period. In Böhme, Schwegler came upon a spirit who could do no more than try to describe with words and pictures something that could not be understood through the intellect. Every purely intellectual means of grasping the repetition of the Saturn picture fails. It is not as if a person cannot understand these things at all, but one cannot grasp them if one only maintains the standpoint of ordinary dry philosophic reasoning. You see, the important point is to lift ourselves beyond the sufficiency of ordinary intellect. Something as excellent as Schwegler's History of Philosophy is still produced by means of ordinary intellectual capacities, and thus remains an example of how an extraordinary intellect is absolutely brought to a standstill by a spirit like Jakob Böhme. Today, in our consideration of ancient Saturn, we have tried to penetrate the inner aspect of this ancient planetary embodiment of our Earth. In the lectures to come, we will do the same with sun and moon existences, in order to arrive at concepts that will be no less impressive than those we achieved when we looked back to ancient Saturn and allowed an imagination to arise in us of the thrones as they sacrificed themselves to the cherubim and thereby created the beings of time. For time is the result of sacrifice and consists of living time. We shall see how all these things will be transformed during the sun existence, and how other mighty processes in cosmic existence occur as we move from Saturn existence to sun existence and then to moon existence.